so you understand something specific about how time works in those mountains, which is that it doesn't always work the way you expect it to. I'm not a person who says things like that. I'm a person who wakes up at 5:30 and checks the forecast and cleans the rifle the night before and drives the same route to the same ridge and does the same things in the same order, because the doing of them in the same order is what produces results. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand who was standing at that mailbox on a Tuesday morning in October, and that person was not someone prone to the kind of story I am about to tell you. The trip had been planned for 3 weeks. The ridge I was going to is one I have hunted for 11 years, in McDowell County, accessible by a logging road that comes off a state route I could drive in my sleep. I had my gear in the truck the night before, everything staged, the kind of preparation that makes the morning simple. I ate eggs and drank coffee at my kitchen table, and I watched the fog sit in the hollow below my property the way it does on October mornings in the Western Carolina mountains, just sitting there, not moving, waiting for a sun it will eventually stop pretending to resist. Everything was as it was supposed to be. I'm going to keep saying that because the normalcy of that morning is the thing that makes the rest of it what it is. I checked the mailbox before I left because I always check the mailbox before I leave for a trip. Not because I expect mail that requires a response before I return, but because the habit is older than the reasoning behind it, the way most habits in a person who has lived alone long enough are older than their reasoning. The mailbox contained one item, a white envelope, standard letter size, my name written on the front in handwriting I did not recognize, no return address, a postmark from a post office in a town about 40 miles east of mine. I looked at the envelope for a moment. I thought about leaving it on the kitchen counter. I want to be honest with you about this decision point because it is the one I return to most often, not because I think opening it changed anything, but because the leaving it would have meant not knowing, and not knowing might have been a different kind of carrying. I opened it at the mailbox. The letter inside was a single page, handwritten, front side only, no greeting, no signature. What it contained was a description of something I would find on the ridge, written in specific enough terms that I understood immediately this was not a general statement but a targeted one. It described the north-facing slope of the ridge I was going to. It described the condition of the light at the specific hour of late afternoon when the sun has dropped behind the western ridge and the light on the eastern faces goes flat and gray-blue. It described a tree, a specific tree, a dead chestnut oak, that has been standing in the same location on that north face for at least the 11 years I have been hunting there, one of the landmarks I used to orient myself on that section of the ridge. And it described what I would find at the base of that tree, at that hour, in that light. I stood at the mailbox and I read it twice. The description was precise in a way that is not possible unless the person who wrote it had been on that ridge and had been at that specific location and had been there in the specific quality of that specific late afternoon. Light. It was the description of someone who had been there and was describing a memory. Not predicting. Describing. The way you describe something you have already seen. I drove to the mountain anyway. I want to be clear about why. It was not bravery, and it was not disbelief in the strictest sense. It was more that the alternative not going, changing my plans because of a letter with no signature and no explanation required, accepting a framework for the situation that I was not prepared to accept at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. So I drove the state route and I turned onto the logging road and I parked where I always park, and I hiked up through the timber section and into the hardwoods, and I set up on the south face in the morning hours the way I always do. I hunted through the morning. I ate the lunch I had packed at approximately 11. I was entirely normal for the first 6 hours of the day. At around 3:30 in the afternoon, I moved across the ridge to the north face. This was not in response to the letter. Moving to the north face in the afternoon is part of how I hunt that ridge, has been for 11 years, because the deer use the north face feeding edges in the hours before last light. I moved to the north face and I made my way along the contour line, and I arrived at the dead chestnut oak. The light was exactly as the letter described, gray-blue, flat, the sun already behind the ridge to the west, the shadow of the ridgeline falling at the specific angle it falls at that hour in October. I stood at the tree and I looked at its base. What I found there I am going to describe to you as precisely as I can, because precision is the only thing I have to offer, and because the precision is what makes the letter impossible. At the base of the dead chestnut oak, on the north-facing side, was a set of objects arranged with intention. Not scattered, not coincidental arranged. 4 items, placed in a configuration that was not accidental. I am not going to describe the items individually, because 2 of them are things I know, and 1 of them I do not know, and 1 of them I have reasons to not describe publicly. What I can tell you is that the arrangement was described in the letter with enough accuracy that when I looked at it, I was not surprised in the way of discovering something unexpected. I was confirmed. The letter had described this arrangement, and I was standing in front of the arrangement, and the 2 things matched. I stood at that tree for a long time. The light changed around me the way October light changes in the mountains when the last of the afternoon runs out, not dramatic, just a progressive diminishing, until the forest has a different quality, the quality of a space that has stopped pretending daylight is coming back. I eventually took photographs of the arrangement. I eventually walked back to my truck. I drove home in the dark on the state route I know well, and I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. I had the handwriting on the letter compared to samples from everyone I could reasonably ask for a comparison: family members, a few close friends, people who had reason to know about my hunting habits. No match. I sent the envelope to a person I know who has professional experience with document analysis. The postmark was consistent with the post office 40 miles east, which serves a rural area I have no particular connection to. The paper was ordinary. The pen was ordinary. The handwriting was described as belonging to an adult who wrote regularly and with a consistent hand, which narrowed nothing. The postmark date was 3 days before the Tuesday I left. 3 days before I had discussed the trip with anyone. I had told exactly 2 people about the trip before that Tuesday: my neighbor, who received mail watching instructions, and my brother, who I had called the Friday before. I spoke with both of them after. The neighbor's handwriting does not match. My brother has never been to the ridge and writes in a manner nothing like the letter. I am not accusing anyone. I am telling you that the handwriting does not belong to anyone I know, and the postmark precedes any disclosure of the trip, and both of those facts sit on one side of a scale, and the impossibility of them sits on the other. I have gone back to that ridge twice since. Once in November of the same year, once the following October. Both times I went to the dead chestnut oak. Both times the base of the tree was undisturbed, showing none of the arrangement. No evidence of what I had found there or of anyone having been there. The arrangement was present once, at the hour, and in the light the letter described, and has not been there since. The letter is in a fire-safe box in my office. I take it out occasionally and read it again. Not because the content has changed, but because rereading it is the thing I do when I need to confirm that I am not misremembering it, that the description is as specific as I recall, that the match between what the letter described and what I found was as complete as I know it was. It is as specific as I recall. The match was complete. Whoever wrote that letter had been at the base of that chestnut oak on the north face of that ridge, in late afternoon light in October, and had found the arrangement there, and had written down what they found, and had mailed it to me 3 days before I went. And I do not know who that person is, and I do not know how they knew I would go, and I do not know what the arrangement means or who made it, or whether it was there before the letter was written, or was placed there in the days between the postmark and my arrival. I have 4 questions that I have not answered in 2 years of having them, and the letter sits in the fire-safe box, and the chestnut oak is still standing on the north face, and the hunt that year was otherwise unremarkable, and I still drive the same logging road and park in the same place, and make my way along the same contour line every October. Some things you keep doing because they are yours to do, and because stopping them would mean the thing that happened there won the part of the contest you are still willing to fight. He was not a man who stopped talking. That is the first thing you need to understand about him, and I need you to understand it before I tell you anything else. Because the thing that happened in the coal camp, clearing off Buchanan County Road 614, is only legible if you know who he was before it. He was a talker in the specific way of men who have spent their working lives outdoors, not a talker in drawing rooms or at parties, but a talker in the woods and in trucks on logging roads and at kitchen tables when the day was done. He could name every ridge in 3 counties and tell you who had logged it and when and what had been taken out and what was still up there. And the talking was never performance. It was transmission, the way a person passes things forward when they understand that the things they carry are worth carrying. He talked about the mountains, the way some men talk about their children, with the combination of knowledge and affection that comes from having invested something real. He logged for 22 years in those southwestern Virginia mountains. Started at 19, the year after he married my mother, and kept at it until his knees made the terrain more expensive than the pay was worth. By then, he had been in every hollow and up every ridge in the relevant counties, and he had done it in every season and every weather, and he had never once, in my hearing or in the hearing of anyone I ever asked, expressed anything other than the easy competence of a man in a place he knew well. I grew up going into those mountains with him, and what I absorbed from him was not fear, but reading the specific literacy of a place understood from the inside. When he stopped talking about the mountains, that summer when I was 28 and he was 54, I knew immediately that something had happened that I had never seen happen to him before. I knew it because the silence was wrong in a way I could feel but couldn't articulate until years later, when I had enough distance from it to understand that what I was feeling was the absence of a thing that had always been present, the way you feel a room differently when a piece of furniture you never consciously noticed has been removed. The trip to Buchanan County Road 614 was his idea. My grandfather, his father, had worked the coal camp that used to sit in the hollow below the access road, the one that flooded in 1962 when the creek came up after 3 days of rain and took the lower structures and 2 men with them. The camp had been abandoned after the flood, the company having decided the liability of rebuilding in a floodplain wasn't worth the remaining seam, and by the time my father was old enough to know about it, the site had been returned to the forest, in the way that Appalachian forests reclaim things completely, given enough decades, until the evidence of what was there is more suggestion than structure. He had always wanted to go look at it. We drove down on a July Saturday, windows down in his truck, the heat coming through in that particular coal country way where the humidity sits on you like something with weight. The access road off 614 was overgrown enough that we parked at the bottom and walked the last half mile. He was pointing things out as we walked. This is where the access road would have widened. This is where the company would have kept the equipment. He knew the history, the way he knew everything about that country, from the inside, from having listened to his father the way I had listened to him. We reached the clearing, which was visible as a clearing only because the regrowth in it was younger and thinner than the surrounding forest, the way a scar is visible long after the wound has closed. He started pointing out the ghost foundations, the depressions, and the subtle differences in the vegetation that mark where structures stood. That low spot was probably a building corner. That slightly elevated line was a foundation wall. He was talking the whole time, the way he always talked in the woods, steady and informative, and with the pleasure of a man doing the thing he was built to do. Then he stopped. I have gone over the specific quality of that stop many times since, and I have never found a better word for it than I gave you. It stopped. Not trailed off, not interrupted, stopped. In the middle of a sentence about where the company office would have been positioned relative to the access road, his voice simply ended. I looked at him because his voice ending was wrong in a way my body registered before my mind did, and his face was wrong in a way I had never seen his face be wrong. He was looking at the tree line on the east side of the clearing. His expression was not fear in the way I would have recognized fear. It was not wide-eyed or open-mouthed, or any of the things fear produces in a person who is responding to an immediate threat. It was the expression of a man who has seen something that has rearranged his understanding of a thing he thought he understood. A settling, a going still. The specific quality of a face receiving information it did not want and cannot unreceive. I turned and looked at the tree line. I cannot tell you what I saw, and I want to be honest about the cannot rather than using it as a way of avoiding the question. The cannot is real. I looked at the tree line on the east side of the clearing, at whatever my father was looking at, and something was there that I am unable to describe in terms that feel accurate. It was not an animal in any configuration I recognized. It was not a person. It was not the absence of anything. It was not a trick of light or shadow that produced the impression of something where nothing was. Something was at the tree line. My father had seen it, and I had seen it, and my father's face was doing the thing it was doing because of what it was, and what it was is the part I cannot give you. Not because I'm withholding, because the part of my brain that processes what I saw and assigns it a category produced no category. It produced the visual experience without the label, which is its own kind of wrong. My father said, very quietly, "Get in the truck." He did not look at me when he said it. He was already moving toward the truck when he said it, already turned from the tree line, and I followed him because his voice carried in it the specific quality of a man who is not afraid of a thing for the first time in his life and knows he should be. We walked the half-mile back to the truck at a pace that was not running and was not walking, something between them. And we got in, and he drove us back up to 614 and out toward the paved road without speaking. I waited for him to say something. I waited through the drive back to the state route, and I waited through the stop at the gas station where he filled the tank, and I waited through the 40-minute drive home, and I waited until we were in his kitchen and he was making coffee, the ordinary domestic act that follows every drive in my family the way punctuation follows a sentence. He handed me a cup. He sat down across from me, and he said nothing about what had happened in the clearing. I asked him about it once, directly, about a month later. I asked him what he had seen at the tree line. He looked at me for a moment, and then he looked at the kitchen table, and he said he wasn't going to talk about that. Not that he didn't know, not that he wasn't sure he wasn't going to talk about it. The distinction matters to me, and I have thought about it often. He knew what he had seen. He had decided not to say. After that summer, he stopped talking about the mountains. Not abruptly, not in the way of a conversation that ends in the gradual way of a subject being allowed to close. If I brought up a ridge or a hollow from our shared history, he would answer briefly and not extend the answer. The way you answer questions about a place you are done with. The specific pleasure that had always been in his voice when he talked about that country was gone, replaced by something I can only describe as a closed door, not hostile, not painful to look at, just closed. I watched it over the 4 years between that summer and his death, and I never saw it open again. He died of a heart attack at 58, in March, in his kitchen, which is where he spent most of his last years. There was no deathbed conversation. There was no note, no explanation, no account of what he had seen at the tree line in the coal camp clearing that July. What he saw went with him, which is the carrying forward that did not happen, and the absence of it is one of the things I have been sitting with since March of that year. I went back to the clearing once, by myself, in October, about 2 years after he died. I parked at the bottom of the access road, and I walked the half-mile, and I stood in the clearing, and I looked at the ghost foundations, and I looked at the east tree line. Nothing was there that I could identify as what had been there before. The tree line was a tree line. The clearing was a clearing. The specific wrongness of that July afternoon was not present, or was present in a form I could not read without him, or was waiting for a condition of the season, or the light that October didn't provide. I stood there for about an hour, and then I walked back to my truck, and I drove home on the state route my father had driven, and I have not been back since. What I know is this: my father was not a man who stopped talking, and something at the tree line of a flooded-out coal camp in Buchanan County stopped him, permanently, in mid-sentence on a July afternoon. Whatever it was, he saw it clearly enough that he made a decision about it, within seconds. A decision to leave, and a decision to not speak of it, and that decision held for the rest of his life. A man who had spent 22 years in those mountains without a reason to treat them otherwise, found a reason in that clearing, and the reason was specific enough and sufficient enough that he carried it in silence for 4 years, and took it with him when he went. I did not inherit the thing he saw. I inherited the absence of it, the closed door, the 4 years of a changed man, and the ghost foundations, the east tree line that is still there, and whatever was there that July is a question that has no one left to answer it. A specific register of sound that the human ear recognizes as wrong before the brain has identified what it is. I know this now in a way I did not know it before the wet March weekend in the Shining Rock backcountry 2 years ago, and the knowing has changed the quality of every quiet room I have been in since. Sound operates below language. Your body responds to it before your vocabulary catches up, and what your body knows in that pre-language moment is often more accurate than any name you eventually put on it. I had been backpacking in the Shining Rock wilderness for about 18 months at that point. Weekend trips mostly, occasionally longer. The late March trip was a 3-day solo, the kind I had done enough times that the logistics were automatic, and the pleasure was in the specifics: the wet spring smell of the high Pisgah, The particular character of the balds in the last weeks before the rhododendron starts. The way a mountain creek sounds different in March than it sounds in July. I had made camp on the evening of the second day, at a site I had used once before, below the tree line on the south slope of the bald section, with good water access and shelter from the northwest wind that picks up in those exposed areas in the late afternoon. Everything was as it should have been. I made dinner. I filtered water for the morning. I got into my tent as the temperature dropped. The sound started at some point after midnight. I had been asleep, and I came awake with it already in progress, which is significant. It was not a sound that startled me awake, but a sound that I was already hearing when consciousness returned, as if it had been going on while I slept, and had finally become loud enough to cross the threshold. It came from above, from the bald section above the tree line, which on that night was about 150 vertical feet above my camp. It was a low, continuous sound, unvarying, at a register that I would place in the range of the lowest notes a human voice can produce, but that was not a human voice, not in the quality of a human voice, not in the behavior of a human voice. A human voice at that register would vary. It would rise and fall even in sustained tones because the human respiratory system introduces variation, and the human vocal mechanism introduces variation, and even a person trying to produce a perfectly sustained tone will produce something that moves slightly. This did not move. This was the same at the first moment I heard it, as it was 40 minutes later when it stopped, and the absence of variation was the first specific thing that was wrong about it. The second thing that was wrong about it was the duration. 40 minutes is a long time for any sound source to sustain a continuous output. I know this because I timed it. I was awake for the full duration, lying in my sleeping bag in the tent, and I watched the time on my phone with the specific attentiveness of a person who needs an external reference to keep their own perception honest. The sound began, based on my phone, at 1:14 a.m. and ended at 1:53 a.m., 39 minutes. I know it ended because it stopped, not gradually, not with any perceptible reduction, but stopped, the way the letter I described earlier stopped, in the specific absence of what had been present. I did not sleep after it stopped. I lay in the tent until first light, and I went out and I climbed to the bald, and I walked the bald section in the morning cold, looking for anything I could identify as a source. I was not optimistic about finding one. What I was doing was confirming the absence of the obvious: no equipment, no person, no animal I could track, no structure or feature that would amplify or produce or explain. The bald gave me exactly what I expected it to give me, which was grass and rock and the view south toward Cold Mountain and nothing else. I hiked out the following morning and I drove home on the state route, and I arrived at my house in the late afternoon. I ate, I showered, I went to bed early, because 3 days of wet spring hiking produces a tiredness that requires no negotiation. I was asleep before 10. At 1:22 a.m. I woke up. The sound was outside my bedroom window. I live in a house on a rural road in Buncombe County, 22 miles from the trailhead. My bedroom window faces west, toward a field and then the tree line at the field's far edge. The window was closed. The sound came through the glass with a clarity that suggested the source was close to the exterior of the house within feet, I estimated, rather than yards. It was the same sound, the same register, the same absence of variation, the same specific quality that I had spent 39 minutes listening to on a mountain bald 2 nights before. I lay in my bed and I listened to it, and I thought about what was outside my window. I thought about it very carefully, because getting up and looking was a decision I could make in one direction and not unmake, and I understood that what I was about to see, or not see, would change something. I got up, I went to the window, I looked out at the field and the tree line. There was nothing in the field or at the tree line that I could identify as the source. The field was the field, the tree line was the tree line. The sound continued while I stood at the window looking at nothing that explained it, and then it stopped, and the stopping was the same as the stopping on the bald, not gradual, simply absent. I have heard it 6 times since, always at night, always at an hour close to the one when I first heard it on the bald, always from the direction of the window. I have gone outside twice, once through the front door and around the house, once through the back door and around the other way. Both times the sound stopped before I reached the window side. Both times the grass was undisturbed. Both times the field and the tree line gave me the same nothing they had given me from inside. The thing I cannot explain is the 22 miles. I can construct explanations for a sound on a mountain bald, even an unusual one, acoustics, atmospheric conditions, an animal I haven't encountered before. The mountain offers a range of explanations I cannot close but can at least hold as possible. The 22 miles are what collapses every explanation I build. A sound that I heard in one location and then heard at my home is either two separate sounds that are identical in every particular, which requires a coincidence I cannot accept, or it is one sound that moved. And if it is one sound that moved 22 miles in 3 days and has been returning to my window consistently for 2 years, then the question of what the sound is becomes the smaller question, and the larger question is why it followed me home and what the following means, and whether it is finished or whether the 6 times are a portion of a longer accounting that I don't have a number for yet. I sleep with the window closed. This has not made any difference to the hearing of the sound, which penetrates glass as if glass were not there. But closing the window was a decision available to me, and I made it because the available decisions are the ones you make, when the unavailable ones are the ones you actually want. It's blue. I need to start there because the jacket is the piece everything else comes from. I bought it in June. Outdoor retailer, Asheville. A mid-layer I had been considering for about a month before I bought it. A specific blue, not navy, not royal, but the particular blue-gray that sits between them and that the manufacturer calls something like slate or steel in their catalog. I have the receipt. I bought it in June, 8 months before I climbed the fire tower in McDowell County. There are pieces I remember clearly and pieces I don't, and I want to tell you both honestly, because the honest version includes the gaps, and the gaps are part of what makes this what it is. What I remember clearly, the drive to the tower on a gray February morning, the access road, gated but not locked, the tower itself, a standard Forest Service observation structure, decommissioned since 1987, according to the signage at the base. The stairs, which were sound but cold, the metal handrail having the specific cold of steel that has been at ambient winter temperature for as long as the tower has been unheated. What I don't remember clearly is the exact order of things once I was in the cab. The cab is the enclosed observation room at the top of a fire tower. This one was small, maybe 10 feet square, with windows on all 4 sides and a door, and the interior had the particular smell of a space that has been closed for years. A dry, paperish smell with something older underneath it. The specific closed space smell of the 1980s, preserved in the absence of ventilation. I remember the windows and the view and the specific quality of the February light, which was flat and gray and even and made the ridge to the south look like a charcoal drawing. I remember the map table bolted to the floor and the firefinder still mounted on it, which was a detail that surprised me because most decommissioned towers have had those removed. I remember walking the perimeter of the cab, looking out each window, and at some point during that perimeter walk I found the photographs. There were 3 photographs tacked to the interior wall, on the south-facing wall above the map table, in the position where you might expect equipment notes or posted regulations. 3 photographs tacked with rust-brown thumbtacks that had been there long enough to stain the paper around the tack holes. 2 of the photographs were what you would expect in a fire tower cab views from the tower looking out. Landscape documentation, the kind of photographs a lookout or a researcher might have taken and left behind. The 3rd photograph was different. The 3rd photograph showed the observation deck from inside the cab, taken through the glass door looking outward at the deck railing and the ridge beyond. The view was recognizable. I was standing in the room it had been taken from, looking at the same railing, the same ridge, the same angle of observation. And in the foreground of the photograph, standing at the railing with his back to the camera, was a person. I need to tell you what I understood in the first moment of looking at this photograph, before I began the process of examining it carefully, before the rational mind engaged with the task of alternative explanations. In the first moment of looking, I understood that I was looking at myself. Not with uncertainty, not with the tentative recognition of a resemblance, with the specific certainty of a person who has seen their own reflection in enough mirrors and photographs and windows to know their own dimensions and posture and the particular way they stand when they are looking at something they have come a distance to see. The figure in the photograph was standing the way I stand. The height was mine. The build was mine. The jacket was mine. The jacket was blue-gray. The specific blue-gray between navy and royal that the manufacturer calls slate or steel. The jacket I had bought in June. The photograph was printed on paper stock that both professionals I showed it to dated to the 1970s or early 1980s. One of them said the print had the characteristics of a darkroom print from that era: the grain, the tonal range, the paper weight and surface. The other said the same thing in different words. Neither found any evidence of digital manipulation, which was what I had brought the photograph to them hoping they would find, because the manipulation would have been the explanation, and the explanation would have closed something that is currently open. I have two facts that cannot coexist in the same photograph: a 1970s or early 1980s darkroom print, consistent in every physical characteristic, with a photograph taken before 1987, when the tower was decommissioned. A jacket purchased in June of last year. These facts do not coexist. They cannot coexist. The photograph contains them both. I have looked at the figure in the photograph many times, trying to find the detail that resolves the impossibility, a difference in height, a posture variance, something in the fall of the jacket that belongs to a different body. I have not found it. The figure is the height I am. The jacket is the jacket I own. The ridge in the background is the ridge visible from the tower I climbed on a gray February morning, which is also the ridge visible in the photograph, and the photograph was taken from a position inside the cab that I was standing in when I found it. What I keep returning to is the tack holes, the rust brown staining around the thumbtack holes in the paper. That staining is the product of time, the slow oxidation of metal into paper, which takes years to be visible at the depth I observed. The photograph had been tacked to that wall for years. It was not placed there recently. Whatever the photograph is, it had been on that wall through multiple winters in an unheated cab, long enough for the tacks to rust into the paper, long enough to acquire the specific smell of the closed room around it. It had been there when someone decommissioned the tower. It had been there for decades before I climbed those stairs on a February morning in a jacket I bought in June. The photograph is in a drawer in my desk. I pass it every day, and I don't take it out every day. I take it out when the alternative, which is the pretending that I don't know what's in the drawer, becomes less manageable than looking at it. Looking at it doesn't help. The jacket is still blue-gray. The figure is still mine. The paper stock is still what it is. The tack holes are still stained. The drawer closes, and I go about my day, and the tower is still there on the ridge in McDowell County, and I have not been back. And throwing the photograph away has never been a decision I could make, because something about throwing it away feels like a mistake I would not be able to take back. Logging roads, the way my grandfather drove them slowly, with the lights on, watching the edges. Not out of caution exactly, more out of respect. Logging roads in those mountains have a quality that regular roads don't have. A quality of being not quite finished, not quite committed to being roads, as if the mountain is always in the process of reclaiming them, and the reclaiming is always only temporarily suspended by the traffic that uses them. You feel this more at night. At night, a logging road feels like a negotiation rather than a route. I had used the road off the ridge above Smith County a dozen times over the years. Coming down from the late deer season in November, when the light goes at 4:30 and you're navigating by headlight through sections of second-growth timber and the occasional exposed ridge where the stars make up for the absence of streetlights. The road was one I knew. 12 times is enough to know a road, not in the way you know a road you drive every day, but in the way you know a thing you have returned to enough times to have a map of it in your body, rather than just in your head. The road begins at the ridge parking area and descends 4 miles to the hook left, which is the turn where the road bends west and begins the final descent toward the state route. I have driven that 4 miles a dozen times, and the hook left was always there at the 4-mile mark, which I tracked by the odometer out of the same habit that makes me watch the road edges. November dark in those mountains is particular, not just dark, but absorptive. The kind of dark that takes the light you give it and doesn't reflect much back. The headlights open the road ahead of me in the way of headlights on a narrow logging road, which is a tunnel of light rather than a sweep of it. I reached the 4-mile mark and the road did not hook left. It continued straight. I notice this with the specific quality of noticing a thing that contradicts a map. Your body holds a brief internal resistance, a checking against the expectation. I drove forward because the road was forward. There was no intersection, no decision point, simply the road continuing in a direction it had not continued before. On either side, the timber was dense and dark, the headlights not penetrating far enough to show me anything beyond the immediate surface of the road and the wall of trees. The road had a surface. It looked used, not freshly graded but not overgrown. The kind of road that has had some recent traffic but not regular traffic. I drove it. I drove it for approximately 8 minutes, which at logging road speeds of 15 to 20 miles per hour represents about 2 miles. The road felt like the road I knew for the first half mile, and then it felt like itself, which is to say it felt like a road I was on rather than a road I knew, and the distinction is the whole thing. At the 8-minute mark, I recognized a rock formation on the right side, a specific outcrop I had used as a landmark on previous descents, one I knew appeared about 3/4 of a mile from the state route. I was where I should have been after the hook left. I was at the right place by the right landmark, and I had not been anywhere I recognized for 8 minutes prior to arriving there. I drove the rest of the descent, and I reached the state route, and I sat in my truck for a few minutes, thinking about the 8 minutes of road. I was not in distress. I was in the specific state I described as quiet, a state of noticing that something does not add up, combined with the particular November tiredness of a hunter at the end of a day, combined with the availability of a simpler explanation, which was that I had missed the hook left in the dark and had found my way onto an adjacent logging spur that happened to reconnect with the main road. I held this explanation for 3 weeks before I tested it. 3 weeks later, I drove the road with my friend Cal, who has hunted those ridges his whole life and knows the road at least as well as I do. I did not tell him what had happened. I said I wanted to check something. We drove the 4 miles from the ridge parking area in the November afternoon, and at the 4-mile mark, the road hooked left, exactly as it always had, and the descent continued as it always had to the state route. There was no straight section. There was no point at which the road offered the option to continue forward rather than left. The hook left was the only option at the 4-mile mark, and we took it, and we reached the state route in the expected time. Cal said I had probably missed the turn in the dark. He said it kindly, the way you say kindly things to someone who has driven a familiar road in bad conditions, and made an error. I told him I hadn't missed the turn. He said probably didn't mean definitely. I said I understood. What I understand is this. I drove 8 minutes of road that does not appear on any map I have checked, that did not appear when I returned to the same road 3 weeks later, and that connected to the main road at a point I recognized from previous use. The road I drove had a surface and was bordered by timber, and had the specific feel of a logging road that has been used within the recent past. I drove it at logging road speed in November dark, and it took me 8 minutes, and I arrived where I should have arrived after the hook left, which is physically consistent with a spur road of approximately 2 miles connecting the main road before and after the hook, at a point roughly equidistant from both. This is the explanation that fits the physical facts. The problem with this explanation is that the road is not there when you go looking for it. I have checked maps. I have looked at satellite imagery. I have driven the road 2 more times since, in daylight, at a slow enough speed that I could not have missed anything. The hook left is at the 4-mile mark, and there is nothing that continues straight. What I drove on a November night exists in my odometer reading, and in the 8 minutes I tracked on the clock, and in the specific memory of a rock formation I know appearing at the end of it. And it does not appear to exist anywhere that can be confirmed. I have stopped trying to confirm it, which is not the same as having stopped thinking about it, and I suspect I will be thinking about it every November when I come off that ridge in the dark, taking the hook left that is always there, watching the odometer at the 4-mile mark, driving the road I know. I check the logbook before I sign it. I do this at every trailhead I visit, any place that keeps a paper sign-in register, and I do it the way I check my truck tires in the morning automatically, before I've fully decided to, the body having taken over a task from the mind, because the mind found the task too expensive. I flip back through the recent entries. I look at the dates. I look at the names. I look at the handwriting. Most of the time I am looking at the entries of strangers on routes I don't know, written in hands I don't recognize, and the looking takes about 30 seconds and produces nothing. and I sign my name and I start walking. Most of the time, it was September, the fourth time I had used that trailhead on the AT in Southwest Virginia. The logbook there is a spiral notebook in a weatherproof box mounted to a post at the kiosk, the kind that gets replaced every season or two when it fills up or when the weather finds a way in. I had signed it 3 times before on 3 previous trips, which meant my handwriting was in it from those visits if they fell within the current notebook's range. I opened it and I dated my entry, and I wrote my name and my planned route and my expected return date, and then I did the thing I always do, which is flip back through the recent entries to see who had been through. 7 entries before mine. I stopped turning pages. The handwriting was mine. I recognized it with a specific immediacy of recognition that requires no deliberation, the way you recognize your own face in a photograph before you've consciously processed what you're looking at. The letter forms, the spacing, the particular way I make the capital letter of my last name, which has a specific characteristic I developed in high school and have never lost. My name, in my handwriting, on the line where the hiker's name goes. My planned route, which was the route I was about to hike, the same route I had planned for this trip, written in my hand as if I had already written it. And the date, October 14th, not September, the month I was standing there. October 14th, which was 3 weeks and 2 days in the future. I stood at the kiosk and I held the logbook and I looked at the entry for a period of time I cannot estimate accurately because I was not tracking time. I was tracking the entry, reading it, rereading it, running through the same inventory a second time that I had run through the first time, arriving at the same conclusions. My name, my route, a date I had not yet lived, written in my hand. Now, I have a photograph of that page on my phone. I took it at the kiosk, standing in the September morning, before I had processed what I was going to do next. The photograph shows the entry clearly: my name, my route, October 14th. It shows the entries above and below it in other handwritings. It shows the logbook's numbered page in the bottom corner, which allowed me to find the same page when I returned. I hiked the trail. This was the decision I made. Standing at that kiosk with the logbook in my hands, I was going to hike the trail I had come to hike. The alternative required me to make the entry mean something specific enough to act on, which I was not prepared to do. So I signed my name below the impossible entry, and I shouldered my pack, and I walked north on the AT, and I hiked for 3 days in the September mountains, and I did not think about the entry more than approximately every 20 minutes, which was the best I was capable of. Now, 3 weeks and 2 days later, I drove back to the trailhead. I did not park. I sat in the lot with the engine running, and I thought about whether I was about to confirm something or find out I had been wrong. And I understood that both of those outcomes were going to leave me with something to carry, though different things. I got out. I walked to the kiosk. I opened the logbook to the page number I had memorized. The entry was there: my name, my route, October 14th, which was today, the date on which I was standing at the trailhead, looking at an entry in my own handwriting dated to this day, an entry I had not written on this day and had not written 3 weeks ago when I first found it. The entry was there, and it was unchanged, and it was my handwriting, and the date was the date. Now, at home, I have the photograph on my phone. I look at it occasionally for the same reason I look at things I can't explain, not to find the answer, because looking at a photograph of a logbook entry produces the entry and nothing else. I look at it to confirm that I am not misremembering, that the entry exists as I remember it, that the 3 facts are as I have stated them. The handwriting is mine, the date was accurate, I did not write it. The logbook at that trailhead was replaced the following spring, as they are replaced when they fill. The entry no longer physically exists, except in the photograph on my phone. I was there when the new logbook was installed. I happened to be hiking that trail in April, and the ranger was swapping them out. I watched the old notebook go into a plastic bag. I thought about asking for it. I didn't. Some part of me understood that the notebook being gone was not the same as the entry being gone, and that carrying the notebook would not give me anything the photograph doesn't give me, which is the entry, and no explanation. Now, every time I hike that section of the AT, I check the current logbook when I arrive, and I check it again when I return. I check the new entries. I look at the dates, I look at the names. So far, nothing has appeared in my handwriting with a future date. I say so far because the so far is the honest qualifier, the honest version of this experience. Includes the possibility that there is a next time, that whatever produced the first entry might produce another, that the 3 weeks of lead time might arrive in a different notebook some September morning when I open the box and flip back through the pages. I don't know how to live with the possibility of a next time except the way I am living with it, which is by checking. By going to the trailhead and opening the logbook and reading back through the recent entries and looking at the handwriting and the dates. By doing the thing that the first entry has made necessary. By being, now, the kind of person who checks.